We don't pay six figures for a friendly face and nice calls. That's what my boss told me when I asked for a raise. I realized I was no longer valued. I was already planning my next move. I, 28F, had been working at the consulting firm for 3 years when I finally worked up the courage to ask for what I deserved. The meeting with my boss was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and I'd spent weeks preparing my case. I had the numbers, the client testimonials, the project successes, everything that proved my worth to the company. When I walked into his corner office, he barely looked up from his laptop. I sat down and launched into my carefully rehearsed presentation about my contributions, the additional responsibilities I'd taken on, and how my salary hadn't kept pace with my performance. I mentioned the industry standards, the value I brought to our biggest accounts, and how I'd consistently exceeded my targets. He listened with the kind of detached attention you'd give to elevator music. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and delivered the line that would change everything between us. He told me they didn't pay six figures for a friendly face and nice phone calls. He said if I wanted real money, I needed to bring in real results, not just maintain relationships. The dismissal in his voice was unmistakable. 3 years of 60-hour weeks, of saving deals that were falling apart, of being the person clients specifically requested, none of it mattered. I was just a friendly face making nice calls. I thanked him for his time and walked back to my cubicle with a smile plastered on my face. But inside, something had shifted. The loyalty I'd felt toward the company, the extra effort I'd been putting in, the late nights I'd justified as investment in my future, it all felt suddenly foolish. That afternoon, I started making some calls of my own. Not the nice, friendly ones my boss had dismissed, but strategic ones. I reached out to former colleagues who'd moved to competitor firms, to clients who'd expressed interest in working with me directly, to headhunters who'd contacted me over the years. The response was immediate and encouraging. Within a week, I had 3 serious conversations lined up. But more importantly, I realized something my boss had missed entirely. Those relationships he'd dismissed as mere friendliness were actually my greatest asset. I began documenting everything. Every client interaction, every successful project, every process I developed or improved. I made copies of my performance reviews, my client feedback, my project files. I was careful, methodical, and completely within my rights as an employee accessing my own work. 2 weeks after that meeting, I got a call from our biggest client. They wanted to discuss a new project, something worth nearly $2 million in billings. Instead of scheduling the meeting through normal channels, I suggested we meet for coffee to discuss their needs informally first. Over coffee, I learned something interesting. They'd been considering taking their business elsewhere because they felt the firm had become too impersonal, too focused on billable hours rather than actual results. They trusted me, they said, and wondered if there was a way to work more directly with me on future projects. I planted a seed. I mentioned that I'd been exploring some new opportunities that might allow me to provide more personalized service. I didn't make any promises, but I left them with the impression that changes might be coming. The next day, I had my first formal interview with a boutique consulting firm. They were smaller, more agile, and very interested in someone with my client relationships. The conversation went better than I'd hoped. They were prepared to offer me a significant salary increase, equity in the company, and most importantly, the autonomy to service my clients the way I knew they wanted to be serviced. But I wasn't ready to make a move yet. I had a better plan forming. I started having casual conversations with other employees, particularly the ones who'd been passed over for promotions or who'd expressed frustration with management. I didn't say anything directly about leaving, but I listened to their complaints and offered sympathy. I learned who else felt undervalued, who else had been dismissed or overlooked. 3 weeks after my boss had told me I was just a friendly face, I walked into his office again. This time, I had a different kind of presentation prepared. I told him I'd been thinking about his feedback regarding my role and my value to the company. I said I wanted to discuss a transition plan that would allow the firm to better utilize my skills while also addressing some concerns I'd identified in our client relationships. He looked interested for the first time in months. I explained that I'd been analyzing our client retention rates and had noticed some troubling trends. Several of our major accounts had been expressing dissatisfaction with the service level they were receiving. I had documentation of these concerns and some ideas about how to address them. What I didn't tell him was that I'd been the one encouraging these concerns, subtly highlighting the firm's shortcomings while positioning myself as the solution. I presented a proposal for a new client relationship management structure that would give me more direct oversight of our major accounts. I suggested that this would allow the firm to provide better service while also freeing up other team members to focus on business development. He was intrigued. The proposal would essentially give me control over our most valuable client relationships while appearing to be a lateral move rather than a promotion. From his perspective, it solved several problems without costing the company anything in terms of salary or benefits. I left that meeting with his provisional approval to develop the proposal further. But I already knew exactly how this was going to play out. Over the next 2 weeks, I refined my transition plan. I scheduled meetings with each of our major clients to discuss their needs and concerns. In each meeting, I positioned myself as their primary point of contact going forward and subtly reinforced their existing frustrations with the firm's current approach. I also continued my conversations with the boutique firm. They were eager to move forward and had prepared a formal offer that exceeded my expectations. But the timing had to be perfect. The breakthrough came when our second-largest client called to express serious concerns about a project that had been mishandled by another team member. They specifically requested that I take over the account immediately and threatened to terminate their contract if changes weren't made. I brought this to my boss as evidence that the new client management structure needed to be implemented immediately. He agreed and authorized me to take direct control of the account. That was exactly what I'd been waiting for. I spent the next week transitioning the account under the new structure, but instead of stabilizing the relationship, I documented every remaining issue and concern. I prepared a comprehensive report showing how the firm's current practices were putting multiple major accounts at risk. Then I scheduled one final meeting with my boss. I walked into his office with my report and a resignation letter. I told him I'd completed my analysis of our client relationships and had some difficult news to share. The problems were more systemic than I'd initially realized, and I didn't believe they could be addressed within the current organizational structure. I presented my findings, showing him exactly how much revenue was at risk and which clients were most likely to leave. Then I told him I'd been offered a position with another firm that would allow me to address these kinds of issues more effectively. His reaction was exactly what I'd expected. Panic, followed by attempts to negotiate, followed by anger when he realized I'd already made my decision. I gave him my standard 2 weeks' notice, but I also mentioned that several of our clients had expressed interest in continuing to work with me in my new role. I assured him that I would handle the transition professionally and wouldn't actively solicit any business, but I couldn't control what clients chose to do independently. The next 2 weeks were fascinating to watch. My boss scrambled to reassign my accounts and tried to convince clients that the transition would be seamless. But the relationships I'd built over 3 years weren't so easily transferred. Within days of my departure announcement, 3 major clients called to express concerns about the transition. They wanted assurances that their service level wouldn't decline and asked detailed questions about who would be handling their accounts going forward. I answered their questions honestly and professionally. I explained that the firm had capable people who would be taking over their accounts and that I was confident they would receive good service. But I also mentioned that I would be joining a smaller firm that specialized in providing more personalized attention to clients with complex needs. I didn't have to sell them on anything. The contrast between the large, impersonal firm they'd been working with and the boutique approach I was describing sold itself. By the end of my first week at the new firm, 2 of my former clients had reached out to discuss transitioning their business. By the end of the first month, we'd secured contracts worth over $3 million, all from relationships I'd built while being dismissed as just a friendly face making nice calls. Update 1. The fallout at my old firm was swift and severe. Within 6 weeks of my departure, they'd lost 4 major accounts, representing nearly 40% of their annual revenue. My former boss called me twice, first to accuse me of violating non-compete agreements that didn't actually exist in my contract, then to offer me a significant salary increase to return. I declined politely and reminded him that they didn't pay six figures for friendly faces and nice calls. I suggested he might want to reconsider that philosophy. The boutique firm I joined was thriving. My client relationships had brought in enough new business to fund the expansion they'd been planning for years. Within 3 months, I was promoted to partner and given equity in the company. But the most satisfying part wasn't the money or the title. It was the call I received from a former colleague who'd been struggling at the old firm. She'd heard about my success and wanted to know if we were hiring. She was tired of being undervalued and was ready to make a change. I told her we were always interested in talking to talented people who understood the value of building genuine relationships with clients. We scheduled a meeting for the following week. Update 2. 6 months after leaving, I received an unexpected call from my former boss. The firm was struggling more than I'd realized. They'd not only lost the clients who'd followed me, but several other accounts had left as well, citing poor service and lack of personal attention. He wanted to discuss a potential partnership or acquisition. He suggested that my new firm might be interested in taking over some of their accounts and possibly hiring some of their staff. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same man who dismissed my contributions was now asking me to save his business. I listened to his proposal with the same detached attention he'd once given me. When he finished, I told him I'd discuss it with my partners and get back to him. We did discuss it, and we did make an offer. But it wasn't the partnership he'd envisioned. We offered to acquire 3 of their major accounts and hire 2 of their junior staff members. The terms were favorable to us and barely adequate for them. He accepted. The final meeting was held in the same conference room where I'd once asked for a raise. But this time, I was sitting on the other side of the table, representing the acquiring firm. The friendly face he'd once dismissed was now the person deciding the fate of his business. As I signed the acquisition papers, I couldn't help but think about how different things might have been if he'd simply recognized my value from the beginning. A modest raise and some recognition might have kept me loyal for years. Instead, his dismissive attitude had cost him his business and handed me the opportunity of a lifetime. When the meeting ended, I shook his hand and thanked him for the opportunity to work together again. I told him I hoped this new arrangement would be mutually beneficial. But as I walked out of that building for the last time, I knew the truth. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic or immediate. Sometimes it's simply proving that the person who underestimated you was catastrophically wrong. The friendly face and nice calls he dismissed had built something he never could, genuine relationships based on trust and mutual respect. And in the end, that had made all the difference. My former colleagues who joined me were thriving in an environment where their contributions were valued. Our clients were receiving the personalized service they'd always wanted. And I was building the kind of career I'd always dreamed of, based on the very qualities my former boss had dismissed as worthless. The consulting industry is smaller than most people realize. Word travels fast about firms that treat their employees well and those that don't. My old firm's reputation had suffered, while our boutique company was becoming known as the place where talented consultants went to build meaningful careers. 3 years later, we'd grown from 8 employees to 25. We'd been featured in industry publications as an example of how personalized service could compete with larger firms. And I'd been invited to speak at conferences about building sustainable client relationships. In my presentations, I always made the same point. The most valuable assets in any service business aren't the systems or processes or even the expertise. They're the relationships built on trust, understanding, and genuine care for client success. Some people in the audience always looked skeptical when I said this. They were usually the ones who believed that business was purely transactional, that relationships were just a means to an end. I never argued with them directly. Instead, I simply shared the results we'd achieved by prioritizing relationships over everything else. The numbers spoke for themselves. But sometimes, after my presentations, someone would approach me privately. They'd tell me about feeling undervalued at their current firm, about being dismissed or overlooked despite their contributions. They'd ask for advice about making a change. I always gave them the same advice: document your value, build your relationships, and never let anyone convince you that your contributions don't matter. And when the time comes to make a move, make sure it's strategic, not emotional. Because the best revenge isn't just proving someone wrong. It's building something so successful that their dismissal of you becomes the obvious turning point in both of your careers, the moment when your paths diverged and theirs led downward while yours soared. The friendly face and nice calls that my former boss had dismissed had become the foundation of everything I'd built since. And every time a new client chose to work with us because they valued personal relationships over corporate efficiency, I was reminded that he'd been wrong about more than just my worth to his company. He'd been wrong about what really matters in business, and that mistake had cost him everything while giving me the opportunity to build something extraordinary.